Welcome to the Powerful Parenting Podcast, where we seek to strengthen parents because powerful parents become powerful leaders and raise powerful children who become powerful leaders. We're on a mission to unlock the collective parenting intelligence of parents everywhere and from every walk of life. As most parents know, there is no one right way to raise every child, and no one of us knows as much as all of us. Parenting can be challenging in more ways than any has ever or will ever be able to imagine. While every child has the same basic needs, each brings an innate uniqueness that can either be explored and augmented or misunderstood and underdeveloped. Adding to the challenge of seeing and developing their innate talents and skills, each child learns in their own unique ways. As much as we parents would love for all of them to learn the same way so we don't have to constantly repeat ourselves. As adults, we aren't any different, except that maybe we are a little more impatient with others and ourselves, and a little more independent with our learning approaches. My guest today is Greg Williams. Greg has 3 kids, a 9-year-old boy, a 7-year-old girl, and a soon-to-be 5-year-old boy. They all love various arts and crafts, stories, screens, and sweets. Of course, the sweets. Their preferred activities range from obstacle courses, like American Ninja Warrior, going on hikes, camping, and building things, to the more artistic, such as drawing, playing make-believe, and sharing stories and thoughts with close friends. Greg is a learning designer, or an instructional designer, at a global consulting company where he creates training materials and content, designs and research insights to help adults of all backgrounds and industries to learn and grow. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Thanks for having me.
Glad you're here. Now, you told us that the hardest thing you've ever tried related to parenting has been self-regulation while a child throws a fit. I think a lot of us can maybe understand that experience, but tell us a bit more about your experience.
Yeah. So in plain speak, it's just not going and having my own fit while one of my kids is dysregulated or throwing their own tantrum. And so I think if you've been a parent or if you're a parent, you understand how often these things can happen, right? Because throughout our day, things don't go the exact way we're planning. And these little humans are trying to figure out what to do. How do I respond? And they haven't learned responses, so they do whatever happens or comes to their minds, right? And so for me, it's harder than I ever thought to actually keep that in perspective. The truth of the matter is that these are inexperienced humans who don't know how to regulate themselves. And it's silly for me to expect them to know how, and yet I do that like not every day. And so being able to keep my cool, or at least process in a way that's healthy for me and for them, and remember what is true about the situation, that's hard.
Yeah, I found it interesting that you referred to it as our own throwing of a fit or our own having a tantrum in response to our children having a tantrum, and how you equate that to the realization that really a tantrum is a response where that fills the space where no practiced or learned response exists, right? So, these inexperienced humans, as you refer to them, they don't have the experience of life yet to have a quiver full of ways to respond to stressful or unpleasant situations. So they throw a fit. They have a tantrum. They're not sure how to respond. Do you find that those are the same reasons why maybe adults have fits and throw tantrums of their own?
Probably. Yeah, I think so. When I think of times that I've quote unquote lost my cool, right? Lost my temper. We talk about losing something as if it's something precious that we hold, but in reality, it's maybe a situation or a moment where some brain scientists could say a lot more about what's going on as you're flooded with these emotions. You don't know, your rational part of you isn't thinking, oh, I'm unhappy, right? We're all human beings and we're filled with these emotions that are important, right? To run away or to fight or whatever. And yeah, as adults, we have those too. You go watch any Adam Sandler movie or whatever, right? What happens when something doesn't go the way they want? There's usually some swearing involved or some punching, right? And there's one reason I think we like to watch that in movies is because we all can relate to feeling like we want to do that, right?
It's very easy to put ourselves in his shoes sometimes.
Yeah. Over time, as things happen, we learn from the world around us, like, oh, those many of us learn. Sometimes it takes me longer to learn than others when it comes to certain situations, but oh, that result is really bad if I act out this way. So maybe I'm going to suppress this moment and I'll suppress it for a long time, but it has to go somewhere. It always comes out. So we have to figure out, for me, I have to figure out how can I process these feelings in a way that is constructive for myself and everybody else, that doesn't involve punching the wall or a person or whatever it means. Right.
Yeah. Those are great insights, Greg. That we as adults a lot of times think that because we're older, we automatically have a quiver full of ways to respond. And we stop doing the work to actually put more tools in our toolbox, more arrows in our quiver to handle different situations. You see this a lot when it comes to, when my undergrad was in the translation field. It was foreign language translation, and you learn this idea, or the reality really, that adult language acquisition is in large part due, or the troubles with adult language acquisition is in large part due to our inability to slow down, our inability to be open, that we don't know how to communicate well, and because we're adults. I've been speaking English my whole life, right? And we don't take enough time to realize that being able to speak does not equate directly to our ability to communicate. And that was the main takeaway from that I got from my translation education, is that when you're talking about changing words from one language to another, the goal is not just changing the words to the equal words in the other language. It's to convey meaning, to communicate what the actual idea being communicated is. And I've found throughout my professional career that that is the case in every facet of life. Literally, when you have a child, you have somebody who cannot communicate verbally except to cry and sometimes scream and sometimes turn so red in the face that no sound is coming out of their mouths. And you're there left with question marks, nothing but question marks. I've changed their diaper, I've fed them, I've patted their back, they've burped, they had sleep. What is the problem? And they can't tell you. That just emphasizes that need for communication is more than just words. It's more than just finding the same words in a different language or a different way of communicating and transposing that, and copy paste into your brain, and all of a sudden you understand what it is that they need. The same type of thing happens between, and I know you've seen this in your professional career, when the legal team needs to provide training to non-legal personnel. How you take that legalese and turn it into English that everybody throughout the company, regardless of their level of education, can understand and accept, right? Because a lot of times these are legal things that people need to accept and acknowledge that they've read and done training on. That's a challenge. It's no different than trying to communicate with a child who doesn't speak any language to that point.
Absolutely.
Now that's kind of a good segue transition to your other experience. You shared with us a couple of professional experiences that were difficult for you. The first I want to touch on is your experience as a second grade teacher. Now, you said that you quit after 6 months. Tell us
Hmm.
about that experience, because I think anybody who's had a child of second grade age, so we're talking, 6, 7, 8 years old, um, children are starting. We know that physiologically, emotionally, they're starting to become self-aware. Some are starting to become self-conscious. Some are starting to become um, uh, self-assured, maybe let's call it that. And that can be a very turbulent and difficult time for kids and the adults who are charged with their care. So tell us about your experience as a second grade teacher.
Yeah, so my circumstances around it were a little unique. I didn't study secondary education or K-12 education as my undergraduate. So I wasn't trained to do it. And I was doing this as a part of a sort of non-traditional certification program, as a volunteer program where you're sent to different parts of the country to teach. And in your commitment to teach for 2 years, you're kind of licensed during the process. And it's in schools that are often traditionally hard to keep staffed. They're in Title I areas. There's a lot of poverty usually, a lot of issues going on beyond just we need teachers, right? And so that was a bit of the context for it. At that point, my wife and I had our first child, who at the time we were living in Utah. I finished school and other things, and we moved to Oklahoma to do this across the country with a 6-week-old baby, and didn't really know a lot of people in that area, have connections. And so there was kind of a lot of just background that set this up to be a hard mountain to climb. Um, and while I'd spent time around kids, it was usually in the environment of like playing with my nephews and nieces for an hour or two, after Thanksgiving dinner sort of thing. Um, I had been a substitute teacher for a little bit, but that was also very low stakes and highly scaffolded. Like there was a lot done for me. And, if the kids were crazy, I just had to make it another hour or two and I was done. But what was really difficult for me about this was just the sheer amount of kids. You have close to 30 children at that age that you described, many of whom have very difficult home lives that I'd never experienced and I can't fully relate to. They have one parent only that's maybe working more than one job, or no parent that they're with. Maybe they're with grandparents and cousins, right? And so it's very difficult that they're coming to school, many of whom aren't fully attached to an adult figure that they, feel safe with, or maybe they are, but not to the extent that, I think that they really wanted or yearned for. Adults were doing their best in their circumstances to help these kids. But when they showed up, like I was used to just playing around with kids, when it's time to teach, so when it came to classroom discipline and how to organize all these things, I was just paralyzed. I love psychology and philosophy. I had all these theories and other junk in my head, but like when it came to practical know-how, I was totally useless, right? Like, if anyone's watched The Good Place, and one of the main characters in that, he's this philosophy professor, and he's paralyzed when it comes to like making regular decisions in the real world because there's always a reason to not do something, right? There's always an
Yep.
expert that has a different opinion than another expert. Anyway, those kind of all those issues came together into one to just make it really not good. And so I was able to leave. And it was really difficult to do, but with the encouragement and support actually of my principal, and I had a teacher sort of coach, they basically said, you really should quit. Not in a firing sort of way, but like in a supportive, this will be best for your mental health and for these kids. And so I I decided that they were right, and it was a hard decision to make, but it was the right one.
Do you feel that that experience made you more apprehensive about having children grow up into that age range, or do you feel like it kind of opened your eyes and helped you prepare more for that?
Probably the latter. I mean, I think the sheer volume of children was the hardest thing. I was less,
Mhm.
if I could get just with one kid, it'd be fine, but I wasn't a specialist working with one kid, right? I had the group. So was I like, oh, cool, I want to have, 15 kids now after that experience? No, I was definitely not that way. But yeah, it definitely didn't scare me to having more kids. It was more
Open
preparatory.
your
And
eyes.
yeah, my daughter, so our second child is actually in second grade now, which is just mind-boggling. It's been many, many years since that experience, but it's really stuck with me.
Yeah. And that's, I want to emphasize a point here because, part of my background was in education. I spent some time as a public school substitute teacher. At one point, I wanted to become a school administrator in public schools. I ended up working in higher ed for about 10 years total, both in administrative and instructional positions. And I just want to send a shout out to teachers who kill it at their jobs because it's hard enough for parents to have one child in that age range, in those difficult age ranges, then to have 25, 30, sometimes more, all in the same class at the
Mhm.
same time. Man, it seems like they should get hazard pay too on top of their regular pay, right?
So definitely. Oh
Uh,
yeah.
and that's and you experienced it. I think. I mean, I know I've substituted a kindergarten class, but we had snack time and nap time. I think maybe I have done other grades, maybe fourth or fifth grade. I don't think I've ever substituted second grade. Seventh, eighth grade, that was a little hard too. That's another age when kids are starting to form more of their opinions of themselves and of adults in their lives and things like that. We all have these multiple formative years that are really turbulent and difficult on the inside. And then I mean, just hail to those teachers that really know how to be there for dozens of children at a time. Um,
Hmm.
and I think, if anything, your appreciation for those kinds of teachers has probably grown
Oh yeah.
tenfold at least because of your experience. One lesson I want to pull out of that experience you just shared is how you took a non-traditional path into teaching, and you had these, like you said, these preformed ideas, philosophies, and whatnot of how to work with kids and what it's like to work with kids. That's really, in a nutshell, what parenting is, right? You don't know what your child is going to be like when they can talk, when they can walk, when they can talk, when they can start running around, when they can start to want things and realize that they can ask for things, and how to get your attention, whether it's positive or negative. You never know what the challenges are that a child is going to bring. And I think a lot of parents kind of get into that mindset of this is just overwhelming. Uh, and 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 maybe some of us, I think a lot of us at some point have felt that urge to cry, one, but two, to say like, what did I get myself into with this parenting thing? I'm not prepared. I've read all these books, even sought advice. I've listened to this powerful parenting podcast. I feel so prepared, at least with ideas, and then comes reality. Now, what do you think has been the hardest thing about, let's just stick with your 7-year-old daughter. What do you think has been the hardest thing about raising a 7-year-old daughter?
I mean, when you first asked, the hardest thing, whether it is is, I think, always remembering that you don't have control. As long as I lived under the myth that I can control the situation, or I can control her, right, or I can control my spouse, you're doomed from the start. Right? Like, you're
Wiser
gonna get
words
really,
have not been spoken, Greg.
yeah, you're gonna get really bad results very quickly, or things might seem to be going amazingly well, but those bad results will come. Could be years later. I've just seen that in adults, right? Where their parents use some techniques that seem to work at the time, but they're still working through the issues years later, right? And so that's probably the biggest thing, is just like, oh yeah, this is literally another person. Sure, she's a lot smaller than I am right now. She can't use bigger words to describe things or whatever. Um, but she's still another human, and I literally can't control any other human and still remain a good person.
Mm.
And so when I remember that, it sets the stage to approach things a different way.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you put it that way. The only person we really have control over is ourselves. Everybody else in our lives, no matter our relationship to them, whether it's personal, familial, work related, they're only led by our influence. That's the most quote unquote control that we can exert over another person. And to take it a step further, as leaders of any kind, leaders in our home, leaders in the community, leaders at work, we only don't control others, we cannot change others.
Mhm.
That change moment happens when somebody decides for themselves to do something different. And that those moments often only come about through the influence of others. And not to go on a tangent, I'm having this conversation with somebody else that our thoughts and our actions, as individual as we might think we're being, or as unique as we think our actions and responses might be, they are all influenced by someone or something else. And that just emphasizes that our ability or inability to effectively influence, especially our children, really comes into play with who they develop themselves into, who they decide to change into as they grow up. If we don't, as parents, fill that need for influence in our children's lives, it will be filled by somebody else or something else. And too often we defer parenting to sometimes teachers, sometimes friends, sometimes, and maybe too many times, media, to fill in the gaps of how a child should inform themselves on the kind of person they want to be. And there's a lot of danger in those things, but we won't go too deep into that. But your emphasis on realizing that we really are not in control, that we are in the passenger seat at best, sometimes the back seat of our children's lives, is an important mindset to have as a parent.
Mhm.
So appreciate that. You also shared an experience about being an entrepreneur and how that was difficult. You started a business that you closed after 2 years. Now, you didn't tell us though if that was a successful close, if it was a quote unquote unsuccessful close, or if it was just a close. Tell me about that experience. What did you do? Why did you start it? What did you do? Why did you close it?
Okay. Yeah, I feel like with parenting, success can be defined a lot of different ways, right? You could say I successfully raised my kids because they all went to Ivy League schools and are making six figures, right? Or you could say I raised successful kids. They all treat people with kindness and and maybe they are both, right? But anyway, success that's a whole different conversation. But
Exactly.
with this, after that experience, trying to teach a classroom and not being successful in the ways I had hoped to be, in terms of staying there at least a couple of years and really developing as a teacher, I came back and to do some graduate school work, and in the process opened a very small video production company. And the idea was to put to use a lot of the things I learned working at a higher education school. It was like a vocational technical college, and it did a lot of like marketing videos and stuff. But my love and passion with all that was talking to people and hearing their stories and editing it in a way that would help other people be inspired by their stories and want to change. So what I loved about that was good and was positive in certain environments, but I had a really hard time selling it because I didn't want to just make your token like YouTube videos and stuff that people usually hire a video guy or a video crew to do.
Yeah.
But over the 2 years that I was doing that, I worked on some pretty large projects and lots of little small ones and stuff in between. Near the end of that time, I joined forces with a web design company and was going to be focusing on creating content beyond just video. But our pipeline really dried up, and for a number of lots of reasons, it didn't make sense to keep dragging things along. We had our second child, was really interested in having things like insurance and so forth. And so I learned so many things that were really valuable, but it was just the right time to pull the plug and to stop doing what we were doing. And so from a financial perspective, it was certainly a failure. And learning perspective, it was a great success. And I definitely could not be professionally where I am now if I hadn't done that experience. And so definitely worth it. Very hard, lots of conflicting things going on. And yeah, I certainly don't regret the things I learned. It was a hard time.
Yeah, and the hard times are often the most replete with learning opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds like it was worth it to you in a lot of ways. And I love the emphasis on the dichotomy between failure and success, or really failure, learning, becoming the success, right? Where
Yeah.
learning and development is the success that you define there. And there's recently in the coaching session I was in, our coach emphasized that when you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. When you say no to something, you're saying yes to something else. There's always the balance. And so whenever you say yes, and he was really emphasizing the point of not needing to be a full-time people pleaser. When you say yes to something, you are saying no to something else. And so you need to learn to say yes to the things that matter to you most and no to the things that don't. Because when you say no, you're really saying yes to the things that matter most to you. And
Mm-hmm.
everything's in balance. You have a quote unquote failure, but it's replete with learning opportunities. And those learning opportunities are often the path between where you are now and where you want to be. Like you mentioned, that experience, even though financially and maybe in business eyes and by all statistics of small businesses out there, you were in the failure category, but it led you to where you are now because of everything you
Mm-hmm.
learned and did, both professionally, like as far as skills and whatnot, but also personally as far as resolve and work ethic, which
Mm-hmm.
are often things that people overlook just in failures, quote unquote failures throughout life. I appreciate you sharing that, Greg. Now we're getting close to time here. I wanna kind of skip ahead because we've talked a little bit about some of the hard parts about raising kids in certain age ranges. I want to spend a little bit of time about what has been the best part about raising a 5 a 7, and a 9-year-old. Like, what are the parts you enjoy the most? Let's have a little lift in this conversation. We spend a lot of time talking about like the hard parts of raising kids, but what are the joys? We just talked about it's duality, right? There's hard parts and there's beautiful parts. So tell us a little bit more about the beautiful parts of parenting your children.
Yeah, I think some of my favorite times that I have with my kids, we do. My wife and I will take turns taking each kid out on like a date. We call it, parent
Yep.
dates. And it doesn't have to be a big crazy thing. Especially when they're really young, it might just be going to a park or whatever. But I really enjoy that one-on-one time, hearing their questions and their thoughts and wondering about things. I think my favorite aspect of being a parent is you can see the world fresh, you see it new, and it's a great opportunity to reevaluate a lot of things, and to
Do
reconsider your opinion on things.
do you have that's a great way to put it, to reconsider your opinion on things. When your kids see the world for the first time, and you have to imagine they are seeing a lot of things for the first time, experiencing a lot of things for the first time,
Hmm.
that fresh those fresh eyes are sometimes blunt sometimes those blunt comments that cause you to reflect and say, "Yeah, why is this so complicated again? When did this become so complicated?"
Hmm.
Can you remember a specific experience that you don't mind sharing where one of your children, experienced the world in a different way that just brought joy to your heart, maybe a smile to your face, maybe a tear to your eye, as they experienced the world for the first time?
Trying to think specifically. I mean, doing things like just going down a water slide, right? Or going skiing, and being able to stand up and go down for the first time. Um, they're very simple things, but there's so much wonder and beauty around us. But when your face is in the screen all the time, right? Or when you're just trying to get to the next hour of the day, you miss it all, right? I miss it all, at least, quite regularly. So when it's just sledding down the hill, right? Or um, recently we were at the beach for my youngest's first time, and they just played a little game of running out into the water, and then as the wave came, running away from the wave, and they just did that back and forth for like 30 minutes, and it's just thrilling. The world that we're in and what's around us. If, like you were talking about with your translation studies, if you can take a second to like stop and just soak it in and delight with them and their delights. So those are a few that come to mind. But another thing is, like, I developed this hatred of mathematics when I was probably in about between fourth and seventh grade.
I don't think
I
you're
don't
the
know where
only
it
one in
came
that
from.
boat. That's a really
I'm not the
large
only
boat, I
one,
think.
right? But as my son's been asking questions related to engineering or chemistry or whatever, my wife is much more of the science brain, but it's my opportunity, instead of like, oh yeah, it's so hard, or oh, math is dumb or whatever. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be like, wow, what an interesting question. Like, let's look at that, because when I was that age, I didn't give myself the time to ask those thoughtful questions. Meant for whatever reason, I mentally shut myself down and I missed a lot because I decided I was someone that hated math. Right.
Mhm.
So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be like, I don't hate math anymore. I'm not the best at it. I could use a lot more practice, but it's okay. And being able to see the world in that totally different way has been really fun. And I'm excited for the things he'll teach me as he gets older and dives into that more. I hope he will.
I love that. I love that too. That he's getting the opportunity to see his father, maybe take a big slice of humble pie and learn math with him, right?
Hmm.
To say, wait, I'm learning the same thing that my dad is learning, and to see that you're willing to start over, to try something new, to do something that was hard for yourself when you were young, and go through that experience with him. There's a lot. being communicated in that act alone. And it's maybe sometimes something that your kids can't verbalize yet, because it's hard to verbalize. It's hard to turn an example that they just live with, because you are who you are, into words that explain why they are the way they are. And that doesn't come for a long time. I think you realize
Mm-hmm.
as you get older, you're like, yeah, my dad this, or my mom that, or my aunt this, or my uncle that, my grandpa, my grandma. You start to realize all the things that they modeled without saying a word about it, and how they
Mm-hmm.
formed your life and your view of the world. Um, he'll appreciate it someday. And if he doesn't have a chance to say it now, he'll or have the words to say it now. You'll see it in how he lives his life later. It's an important thing for all parents to realize, that expressing to your kids that you don't know something is a very powerful lesson, that it's okay to not know everything as you grow up, and to ask for help, and to learn new things even when you're older. It takes the pressure off of young adults, especially, the anxiety of, and that feeling of needing to know everything about, quote unquote, adulting, as if adulting were a checklist of things to do. And a bill to pay, a job to go to, a tank of gas to fill up. That's adulting. No, that's not adulting. Adulting happens on the inside, and adulting happens in the heart, in the mind, and in learning the lessons retroactively that brought you to be the person that you are. That's adulting. Um, I wish there were a checklist to go through every day to say, okay, I did my adult duties for the day. I'm good. The world should be in balance, but it's not that way, and it's much less so for parenting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in the final minutes we have, Greg, I want to kind of combine the last two questions here, and get your thoughts. And there is no agenda behind these questions. This, as I explained before we started recording, this whole podcast, the purpose of the podcast is uh, to put collective knowledge out there for people to find something that resonates with them. So share what you want to share, how you want to share it with this final question here. The research has shown that the global fertility rate has been declining since the 60s, meaning people are having fewer and fewer children. What would you say to the parent who is either thinking about having their first child or their seventh child, that are looking for just a little help and guidance? What would you want to communicate to them?
I think there's a few parts to that. So first is there's recently Daniel Pink wrote this book about the power of regrets, and in that book it talks a little bit about how an astonishingly tiny fraction of people ever regret actually having a child.
Hmm.
Before you have the child, it's a hard decision, and if you're even considering it, and you're open to it, that's great. That doesn't mean you should go ahead and do it, but that I thought that was an interesting statistic around regret. I don't have the exact number, but it's really slim, and I think there's reasons for that I don't fully understand yet, because I'm not, looking back, well, across the life of 80 plus years or whatever. I don't have, teenagers or adult children yet, so I think there's just an astonishing amount of richness and growth in there, but it's also really hard, and it's unique to everybody and their needs on, whether you're going to have a kid or how many you're going to have. Now, guidance or help, I've been thinking about a lot over the last couple of years, the term just maturity, what it means to be mature. What is maturation? What does it mean to be a mature person? Or the idea of, like you were talking about, adulting. What does it mean to be a grown up? I keep thinking, oh, maybe now I'm a grown up. I got married, or I got my first job, or whatever, but I still never really feel like a grown up. even after having a child, I'm like, am I grown up yet? And I think it comes down to this idea of maturity, which is way bigger than anything I can talk to off the bat. But it's this idea of like parenting is a lot less about your kid than it is your own development than I realized, right? And I don't say that in a way of like navel gazing, like just focus on yourself and everything will work out. It's not what I'm saying, but I think as the more mature of a person you can become, meaning you realize the importance of relationships in your life, but your relationships don't govern your emotional state at all times or your sense of worth, right? If you're able to have a solid sense of identity and you're differentiated from everybody around you, you can validate yourself. You can calm yourself down when you're really upset. All of those things are going to become instrumental to helping you be a better parent. I feel like as I've been trying to develop those in myself, it's made such a huge difference for me as a parent. So there's lots of resources and guidance and books and stuff out there. And I think it can be really overwhelming to people, but I've identified some themes over the courses of books that I've read that have been tremendously valuable for me. And it often comes down to that, like the ability to regulate yourself and then view kids as other human beings who need connection, but don't know how. Like those two things have been really instrumental for me and can be valuable. And so the type of kid that you raise and the choices they make, while you influence them, you do not control them. Thus, how your kid turns out is not a definition of you or your worth, and you have to let go of that. And for me, that is very freeing, right?
I think that would be freeing to a lot of parents and a lot of potential parents. And the funny thing is that we realize that as adults, we realize that we've made a lot of decisions on our own. There are some adults who in younger years and earlier years did experience some very traumatic events that altered the course of their opportunities for learning and development. And there are some who rise from that, who rise from the ashes of terrible, terrible experiences, and those who become buried in the ashes and find it troubling or difficult to dig themselves out. But in the end, whether you're standing on top of the pile of ashes or you're just getting your first glimpse of the sun after being buried in it, that's when the realization happens that who you are is solely your own making. And you become more grateful for those people who guided you along the way, who supported you, who put the Band-Aid on your boo-boo, who dried your tears, who really were constant in their being there for you as you went through life. And it's at that moment where you realize what you just said. My kids are not of my own making. They make their own choices, but I model what good decision making or bad decision making looks like for them. And they learn, they see, they look up to you. Just innately, they look up to their parents. And you see it even in broken homes where a child will still want to be like that dad that is hardly ever there. They want to look up to their parents and they learn from them. And so it's important for us to realize that you're right. It's not all about ourselves and becoming the best us, but becoming the best us for the purpose of providing the best model we can for our kids is what parenting is all about. I'm really grateful to have learned that lesson from you today, Greg. I appreciate it, man. I appreciate your time. If you found anything in this episode helpful, interesting, uplifting, or inspiring, please do me a favor and share it with someone who will be strengthened in their parenting as well. If you would like to learn more about our coaching programs, visit our website at scheduleme.beaparentfirst.com to get on the schedule of one of our coaches. As always, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for listening, and I hope you feel inspired to be present with your kids and to step into the best version of yourself to become the parent your kids deserve.